Well, what a great question and very challenging to answer because someone like Jean Piaget has contributed enormously to how we understand learning in the educational field. So it's tough to necessarily do a direct lineage, but certainly the big emphasis of Piaget was the recognition that learning is multifaceted. It's a complex process. It's not something that can be reduced to sort of a mechanical relationship.
Not behaviorist.
That exactly, and I think that was the big break that he provided for the field of learning as a whole. Now, much of his work was focused on his work with children and interactions with children and looking at different stages of development in learning. But if I was to sort of draw a bit of a connection, I would say Piaget heavily influenced Seymour Papert, who was a student actually, and an entire series or a generation of folks who looked at learning from a less structured manner and looked at how people develop ideas and how they create or construct new ways of looking at the learning process. So I think in that regard, there's a huge tribute to the work of folks who made that transition from behaviorist to something that's a little bit more aware of how complex learning is as an experience. Where I think connectivism differs from the constructivist camp is that within constructivism there is a heavy emphasis that the learning process is generative and iterative, which we would share as well. But the big aspect within connectivism is that when you take two pieces of information and you connect them, the knowledge is what happens in that point of connection. And when you then look at a complex knowledge challenge, one example I've used in the past is what happened in 2003 with the SARS epidemic that started out in China and sort of spread around the world. That's what I would look at as a complex knowledge problem, which means that no one person knows how to solve it, and even if a group of people get together, it's hard to solve. What happens instead is you take specialized knowledge. In this case, it was research labs from around the world that were working together, but they weren't collaborating necessarily. They were developing individual expertise, sharing it with others, and then others recognized that, connected to it, and that's where the knowledge started to happen and develop. So the big difference with constructivism and connectivism is the recognition in connectivism that learning is something that happens when we connect to different specialized subsets. But again, the history back to Piaget and others is quite clear. Well, social networks, we've always learned in social networks. So the fact that we now make them explicit through various social media technologies that we use daily, that sometimes makes us think, oh, this is new, because now we're using mobiles and other ways of connecting. But in fairness, we've historically always learned through social network, whether it's apprenticeship models of learning, whether it was learning how to be a farmer from people in your community and so on. But the big part of being able to connect to others is having a structure that allows for fluid and rapid connections to form. Historically, our connections have been geographic. Meaning we had to be in the same areas as someone else to acquire that expertise. What's changed with social networks in a digital age is that those connections are now global. That means that someone in France can connect with someone in Quebec, can connect with someone in Alberta, who can connect with someone in Africa. And that process of doing that very easily without a lot of friction is what is new. And that's, I think, representative of knowledge in a complex society where we can't solve problems on an individual basis the way we could in the past. And we don't even solve problems within communities as such, but we solve problems by networks, because a community has the assumption of strong social ties. But a network means we make our knowledge transparent and others find it, discover it, connect it, build on it, and advance it. Well, this is, it's reflective of this general concept of what is it that we need in a knowledge society. So a production-oriented economy, and this is a common criticism, But in a production-oriented economy, we need an education system that is similarly structured and organized, and really, for lack of a better word, reflects producing students. And so our curriculum, our classroom model, everything is designed by this goal to create a certain kind of student who has a certain kind of knowledge. And the ex-MOOC initiatives, such as is being done through large MOOC providers right now out of US, but I know many parts of the world are now starting with a similar approach, is that we take a group of students, we tell them what they need to know in the form of a video lecture or reading text. Then we have the students do some level of assessment, either automated through machine learning approaches or through peer assessment. And through that process, we are then able to validate and say, now you know what I know. And that works well if there's a clear learning goal and if it's more production oriented. And that I would look at as a duplication theory of knowledge. And that's the ex-MOOC model, which means here's what the experts know. Now you learn it. Voila, you are now an expert. Or at least in that area. Whereas with the CMOOC, it's based on just my own thinking and the work that Stephen Downs and I have done in connectivism. The approach is very different, which says we don't know exactly what the goal is in the learning process. We don't even know exactly the shape and the structure of that knowledge domain. So instead of producing what I know in another student, part of the goal is to connect students to each other, to other faculty, to people teaching the course, and in the process have them generate knowledge. So probably the best way to describe it is an ex-MOOC is about duplicating what is already known, whereas in a CMOOC, our focus is on creativity and generating knowledge. So it's a knowledge generative kind of an approach. Activism view of learning, which is that we learn by connecting our specialized knowledge. And whereas in an ex-MOOC, it's more about we learn by duplicating someone else's knowledge. So, this isn't 100% fair, because you can take an ex-MOOC and get a foundation of knowledge which you can then use to build on. So it's not that we can necessarily say the ex-MOOC is better than or worse than a CMOOC. They're very different because they serve different knowledge needs. And so a core view that I have is, I think many others do, is that in a knowledge economy, the most valuable thing that we need is to be able to generate and create new knowledge. And as a consequence of that emphasis, so let's say if you look at the big problems of the world, global warming, you look at poverty internationally, conflict, these are not problems that we're waiting for an Albert Einstein to come solve for us, because they won't be solved that way. The very complex problems that humanity now faces are going to be solved by connecting the knowledge and expertise that exists in different parts of the world, different regions of the world, and using that network mindset to be able to address these very challenging issues. So my assertion is that to deal with the difficulties and the complexities that humanity faces, a generative knowledge model is what is needed, not a duplication knowledge model. Well, I think on a few ways. So I'll actually address that question in two ways. So I'll talk a little bit about connectivism, and then I'll talk a little bit about MOOCs, because they're one version of the CMOOC model, at least. So I think in companies already, they might use different language to describe it, but I would very much look at it as networked knowledge. And this is something that's reflected in a company that begins to use social media, for example, in enabling more fluid connections globally. So if you have a large company that has 70,000 or 80,000 or 100,000 employees, you have a lot of expertise that is located globally. And a key challenge for that company is to be able to know what do we know. Because if you know what you know, then you can start to connect pieces. There are several ways of doing this. One way is through social means, and this is what we do already in many cases, but it becomes easier when we have, let's say, a directory of contacts, when we have a way to follow other people on internal social media like microblogging or blogging, when we can collaborate through wikis or other approaches. Yeah, exactly, knowledge management. So that's one approach, and that's the social approach. The problem with the social approach is it works well if you have a smaller group of people. But if you have a very large group of people, the social approach to discovering knowledge becomes somewhat difficult to use because it's kind of like following what everybody is saying on Twitter. It's impossible. There's too many people. So this is where machine learning starts to become important. And so in connectivism, in this model, what we do organizationally is we begin to look what are the patterns of conversations, whether they're tracked through tags like hashtags or similar approaches, or whether they're just data mined, and what are different parts of the company talking about, and can we then connect somebody who's working in a New York office, who's working on a project, the system should then recognize somebody in Senegal is working on a similar problem or solved a problem 3 months ago, and then the system would automatically recommend, oh, from the looks of what you're typing in your emails or what you're writing in your report, this is what this colleague in Senegal did, and this is how she solved that problem. And then being able to connect those very easily and fluidly would be the goal. So from a connectivist end, there's the social approach and the technical approach organizationally. The use of MOOCs in an organizational context is one area that hasn't been developed significantly yet, but there's a few promising or a few interesting approaches. For example, organizations like Red Cross and Red Crescent that are looking at a way of developing the capacity of their entire network. Or let's say the initiative of AT&T collaborating with Georgia Tech and Udacity to develop a master's program in computer science. I think those are examples of companies looking at MOOCs from a few ways. One, you can look at them as advertising and marketing. You can also look at them as ways of capacity developing your organizational competence so that you can better meet your vision or your mission goals.